Food for the collapse. Top 4 to stockpile. The possibility of societal collapse is a solid reason to start stockpiling food for the apocalypse. Dry staples like white rice, dry beans, grain, canned and freeze-dried foods, and produce preserved from a survival garden, will help keep you sustained when the supply chain breaks down. These 4 major types of food have a 5 to 30 year plus shelf life, and each serves a purpose in your survival food stockpile. It is a distinct possibility that we will face economic collapse in our lifetime. If it's not economic collapse, it could be any number of natural or man-made disasters that could cascade into a full-blown meltdown. The worst-case scenario has you stockpiling food in bulk to save money on your budget or provide sustenance in case of job loss or another family emergency. Okay, let's move on to the types of food you would store for the apocalypse. And if you like this article, check out Ready Squirrel's most popular article on societal collapse, 26 Ways to Survive Societal Collapse. And I'll have a link down below to readysquirrel.com for this article if you would rather read it than watch me gab. Okay, do-it-yourself survival foods and oxygen-free storage. To me, this is the pinnacle. This is the bedrock. This is the cornerstone. These are the rock stars of long-term food storage and survival. Maybe not ideal for short-term emergencies, like where you're without power or running water for a couple days, but these are the foods that have supported cultures for thousands of years. The Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians. Wheat has been cultivated by man for 12,000 years. So, I mean, you can't get any more evidence that something will help you survive or a food will help you survive than that. I mean, if you think about it, the Bible was written, 3,500, 4,000 years ago, and wheat has been cultivated for 12,000 years. So the staples, wheat, white rice, Southeast Asia has supported Chinese dynasties and cultures. Wheat has been used for thousands of years in the Middle East. The dry staples are what are going to keep people from starving in really hard times. Okay, so if you're just getting started with emergency survival, these are the foods that I would focus on. Don't get too hung up on the psychology of eating or is my family going to like this so much? White rice, wheat, and dried beans, in my opinion, should be the bedrock, or grains in some fashion with that 30-year shelf life should be the bedrock of every long-term survival food pantry. Okay, so white rice and beans alone do not give you all the nutrition you need, but will sustain you for a significant amount of time. The bulk of my long-term food storage is hundreds of pounds of hard white wheat. I chose hard white wheat because it's the most mild, it's the easiest transition from white bread. I picked hard white wheat because the hard wheats have more gluten for risen bread. More than likely, my staple wheat is going to be used primarily to make homemade bread. That's going to be the daily staple. Black beans, white navy beans, pinto beans, white rice, low-fat powdered milk, bulk sugar, salt, and condiments like soy sauce and vinegar. 6 pros of staple foods: inexpensive, long storage life, proven track record, bedrock survival foods, sprouted for fresh greens. Don't underestimate sprouted for fresh greens, especially if you live in a cold area. I actually have a video sprouting wheat that I purchased online to make microgreens. Imagine you're in a cabin in Alaska. There's 3 feet of snow on the ground. You're out of vegetables. All you've got is rice and beans. You can take those beans, you can take some of your wheat, and you can actually sprout it for microgreens. So you've got like an instant garden. You can sprout in just about any environment. And on top of that, as long as the grains or the beans are still viable, you can grow them in a survival garden. These foods are inexpensive. You can purchase hundreds of pounds of dry staples like white rice, beans, and roll oats for pennies. When you compare it to other types of survival food, like the prepackaged stuff, It's to me, the staples are a no-brainer. You don't see them advertised as much, and all of the other types of survival food have a place in your emergency pantry. But these are the foods that you should be focusing, I think, the majority of your effort on, especially in the beginning. Long storage life. Dry staples less than 10% moisture, like white rice, dried beans, rolled oats, and wheat, have a shelf life of 30 years when stored in Mylar with oxygen absorbers. Mylar, food grade buckets, oxygen absorbers, that is hands down the best do-it-yourself at-home method of storing dry staples in long-term storage. Number 10 cans are awesome, but most of us have to purchase those. So again, Mylar, oxygen absorbers, food grade buckets are the best option for that. And I have a lot of articles on that packaging system and why I think it's the best. But I'll go over it briefly. Mylar, okay, the food grade bucket protects the Mylar. Mylar is a space age product. It is a true oxygen barrier. It's a true moisture barrier, and it's a true light barrier as long as it's 5 mil plus in thickness. So the Mylar alone, that's been sealed with enough oxygen absorption inside, or treated with oxygen absorption, the Mylar itself is enough to protect your food. The reason you have the food grade bucket is like armor. It's like the Mylar is going to battle. It's going to be stuck in your food storage location for 30 plus years. It could get physically damaged. It could be chewed through with rodents or chewing insects. So the bucket's going to help you with that. Storing food just in buckets is a possibility, but it's for short term. If you want long-term storage, you have to protect food against oxidation from oxygen itself and from light. Plastic is not an oxygen barrier and does allow for the transfer of oxygen back and forth inside and outside of the container. That's one. So what happens if you don't get the oxygen levels down below 1% in the storage container and you want to get that 30-year shelf life? Well, any of the bug eggs, pupa, adult bugs in there will live for a while. They can reproduce, the bugs can hatch. So 30 years later, you could open that bucket and it's an outhouse for weevils. Food oxidation, or light oxidation rather, buckets do protect against that. The second thing is bucket lids. The seals on bucket lids, even the quality lids, are known to fail. The reason I'm saying this is because you get a lot of disinformation. People want to save a little bit of money. I get that. Mylar bags, food grade buckets, the lids, the oxygen absorbers. I mean, they're relatively inexpensive when you compare packaging that way to purchasing prepackaged or professionally packaged survival foods. Okay, so another good way to purchase staple foods is in number 10 cans. I kind of already alluded to that. The LDS store online, Latter-day Saints, I'm not LDS, you can still buy in the store. They sell number 10 cans at a reasonable price, and they have reasonable shipping. What I like about number 10 cans is they're bulletproof. They really are, if you keep them dry, they really are probably the best container for long-term storage. And the second thing I like about number 10 cans is the portion control. You know, if you open a 5-gallon food pail with white rice or wheat, you're exposing, 37 pounds of wheat to oxygen. So what are you going to do with that wheat? You've got to use it before it heads south. If you're using a number 10 can, I think it's, if I remember correctly, a number 10 can holds 5.5 pounds of hard white wheat berries. So you're exposing a lot less food when you're using number 10 cans. I have both. I do have some number 10 cans of various food types, but well, there you go. You can make the decision on how you want to do it. When you start out, I think the fastest, easiest, cheapest, most effective way to store hundreds of pounds of emergency food for long-term survival is the trifecta: buckets, Mylar bags, and oxygen absorbers. So the dry staples are bedrock survival food. I kind of already talked about that. A lot of people complain that the bedrock foods are bland. You know, it's white rice, it's wheat, it's beans. Imagine you have an emergency garden or even just an herb garden. You can incorporate those ingredients. You can dry those ingredients, incorporate them into soups and stews. And you can also store condiments that have indefinite shelf life, such as the vinegar, soy sauce, sugar. Sugar can actually be used with beans. Sugar has an indefinite shelf life. White table sugar does. You can make sweet beans with that, which is a filling for pastries. So there's a lot of things you can do with the products that have the indefinite to 30-year shelf life to create a little bit more interesting meal. So don't just go, oh, they're bland, because there are other products that you can store around these base items that will give you some pretty tasty food. And I said they're sprouting grains and beans, but I think I'd already talked about that before. Yeah, as long as grains and beans are still viable, they can be sprouted for nutritious greens. There's a link to the video on YouTube if you read the article, or you can just do a search on my channel. Yeah, that's basically the same story I talked about before. For some reason, I have this story stuck in my head about, a cabin in Alaska and 4 feet of snow on the ground when I think of sprouting beans. Okay, sprouting beans in a survival garden, I kind of talked about that. So the 8 cons of dry staple food, and this kind of more alludes in my mind to short-term emergencies, power's out, water's off, it's a hurricane, you're without power for 2 weeks. They're kind of a pain to prepare, and they require water, fuel, preparation time. Some of them require processing with special equipment. So like wheat, for instance, unless you want to boil it, which you can do and eat it like porridge, you have to mill it into flour. And that is a buttload of work. I also have a video on that if you're interested. Bulk staples are not good for bugging out, maybe even in a vehicle, because they're heavy. They're heavy. Once you get your stockpiles built up for a family of 4, you need a lot of time and probably a lot of trips to move enough heavy staples from one location to the next. Obviously, they're not ideal for bugging out. You want to look more towards a freeze-dried, like a Mountain House meal or something like that for bugging out. They're not ideal for short-term emergencies like what we already talked about: water, fuel, time. The last thing you want to do in post-hurricane, when you're mucking out your house with all the groundwater and all the debris and stuff that's been washed in, is spend 4 hours to cook, beans and white rice. You want a can you can open or a bag you can open and just eat. So if you're interested in this subject, you might also like Ready Squirrel's comprehensive article, Societal Collapse, the Road to Self-Reliance. I'm not really sure what's up with that link. I'll have to check it. That is not right. And then I just basically go through what we already talked about, these bullet points, but I just pretty much said it off the top of my head. Chart 1, dry grain for societal collapse, 1 year supply per person. Brigham Young University suggests 132 pounds of hard wheat, 65 pounds of white rice, 29 pounds of rolled oats. Rolled oats are awesome. It's basically what it was the staple food of a Scotch Highlander. They were feared in battle. They were tough. They walked 20 miles a day, doing hand-to-hand combat and moving their cattle from one valley to the next, walking straight uphill. Rolled oats are one of the few soft grains that are outstanding for long-term storage. 30-year shelf life if you store them oxygen-free. Pasta, 21 pounds. These amounts are interchangeable. So you don't have to store any hard wheat if you don't want to. You just have to have the pounds and the calories in place. Legumes for societal collapse, 1 year supply per person. Again, this is coming from LDS, Brigham Young University. They suggest 21 pounds of dried beans, 21 pounds of split peas, and 21 pounds of lentils. I like lentils because they're super easy to cook. They cook much quicker than, say, a pinto bean or a navy bean, and they're delicious. I like to make like a garden stew with them. Cut up carrots, celery, put in some cumin, chili powder, salt, and pepper. cook that down, make a pot of white rice, and then when I'm eating it, I sprinkle it with vinegar-based hot sauce like Tabasco, which has a pretty good shelf life. Dry dairy for societal collapse. Milk, non-fat powder. They suggest having 49 pounds. I don't really like powdered milk. I don't think most people do. Primarily used for baking. I watched a video, like a video interview of the stuff that was going on in Venezuela. One of the number one products people were trying to get a hold of was non-fat powdered milk and baby formula. So it's a commodity if shit goes south. So other dried foods for societal collapse, 1 year supply per person: sugar, apple slices, potato flakes, dried carrots, dried onions, iodized salt, baking soda, baking powder, vitamin C. And then I've got the amounts over here: 70 pounds of sugar. See, sugar and salt are not just to be, so you can, with sugar and salt both, you can preserve foods, you can enhance flavor. Both of them have an indefinite shelf life. So there's a lot of talk about, well, if you store something oxygen-free on accident, which I actually did. I stored a bag of sugar oxygen-free. So when I take that sugar out of there, it's going to be rock hard. Well, guess what? It's still edible. It's a pain in the butt. I'm going to have to grind it, but it's still edible. But sugar and salt are indefinite. Roman soldiers were partially paid in salt for a reason. It lasts forever. It's used for food preservation. It's used as a spice. If the supply lines quit running, sugar and salt, I believe, will be almost like having currency. They're going to be valuable. People are going to want them. So don't just store sugar and salt for your food base. Also store them for barter. And I mean indefinite shelf life. Sugar and salt, indefinite shelf life. And compared to other foods, just ridiculously cheap. Okay, how to store wheat. This video is the same way you store all dry staples less than 10% in moisture, low in fat. You don't want to store foods higher than 10% in moisture because there's a risk of anaerobic food poisoning called botulism. It's nothing to be super scared of. It's fairly rare, but it's deadly, so you want to make sure that you dot your I's and cross your T's when you pick what food to store in that trifecta of Mylar bags, food grade buckets, and oxygen absorbers. Survival canned foods. Canned foods help round out the nutrition of dry staple foods, cut down on palate fatigue, eating the same food day after day. My family eats canned beans and the occasional can of sauerkraut, but we avoid eating out of a can for the most part, so rotating canned food is a challenge. So let's take a look at the pros and cons of canned food. 5 pros: inexpensive, ready to eat, shelf stable, good for short-term emergencies like FEMA's 72-hour emergency kit, and you can get full canned meals like pasta meals, like Dinty Moore stew, where you're not cooking individual ingredients, you're getting a full meal. So you could eat a big can of Dinty Moore stew, have a box of saltine crackers, sit down with some canned juice, and you've pretty much got a full meal for lunch or dinner. Canned foods are relatively inexpensive if you shop the sales, and that also depends on what food it is. Canned meats are very expensive, especially the good ones. I'm thinking of like Keystone canned beef and chicken. You're going to pay for those. You're going to pay for meat, protein, pretty much no matter how you buy it. Canned, freeze-dried, it's expensive. So survival canned foods really shine for short-term emergencies. They have a 2 to 5 year shelf life, depending on if they're high acid or low acid, and that is controversial. I'm going to leave it at that. It's controversial. Most canned foods will probably last more than the best by date because that's not actually an eat by date. But once the best by date passes, there is a chance that the food will decline in quality and nutritional value. And you won't really know when that date is. So that's something to keep in mind. So again, you want to rotate the canned foods that you're going to use for emergencies so that you always have a fresh supply. Canned foods are ready to eat, and I'm also talking about like canned soups and stews, which I definitely would not want to eat cold. I'd want to at least heat them up on a backpacker stove. but you can eat them without heating them up. They're pre-cooked, unless it otherwise indicates on the can. So again, I said short-term emergencies, canned meals, rotation required. Downside of cans, they're super heavy, so they're not ideal for bugging out in a vehicle or on foot. You could take a sizable amount of cans in a vehicle, but yeah, they're heavy. Freeze-dried survival food is outstanding pretty much in every way, and it is expensive in pretty much every way. On a personal note, one of my dream tools that I want to have is a home freeze-dry unit. I don't have one. If you buy prepackaged freeze-dried meals from Mountain House, they're expensive. The unit to freeze-dry at home is expensive. Freeze-dried food is expensive, and if it's properly packaged, it has a 30-year shelf life. It's ideal for bugging out because it's super ultra lightweight, and it retains 97% of its nutritional value. I've seen different numbers on that, but they've all been over 90%. Can be reconstituted by just throwing into a soup or stew, or you can actually use water to reconstitute. So it's good food. It's good food, and I have a very limited quantity of it because it is. I mean, one freeze-dried family meal at Walmart, I think, is almost $10. So there's the cons. Expensive, requires fuel and water to prepare. You can cold soak them, but ick. I'm not a fan of eating a cold meal, but you could if you had to. I think it's double the time if you cold soak. So just a little story. When I hiked the Vermont leg of the Appalachian Trail, I ate a lot of Mountain House meals. They're excellent for occasions when you're tired and need fuel. What I mean by fuel is not fuel to cook, but just you need energy because you just boil and eat. And some of the dry packaged foods are also really good for that. Survival, garden and food preservation. So I'm not going to go over this because I'll go down a rabbit hole. But you want to have a survival garden, and don't not do it just because you can't have 1 acre and supply all your own food and can your own food. Like even a really quality herb garden is huge. You can grow vertically if you have a small space. You can grow on a patio if you live in an apartment. You can grow with green lights inside. You may just grow Thai basil and parsley and some of the herbs like that, some of the tender herbs. But this breaks down how much garden space you theoretically need to feed from 1 to 10 people. Conclusion, I'm not going to go over that because 90% of it's going to be probably what I've already discussed. So there will be a link in the descriptions to this article, Food for the Collapse, Top 4 to Stockpile. This is Scott with Ready Squirrel, ReadySquirrel.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.